All right. Good evening, everyone. We're so excited to have everyone back in person for the lecture series this year. And I wanted to say hello to everybody who is watching online. We're really grateful to the public library for partnering with us for this program and providing the infrastructure to be able to do a hybrid program. So we're able to offer it online and in person. It's so exciting. Welcome to our first lecture of the 2022 season. We will have time at the end of the program tonight for Q&A. So get your questions ready. And if you're watching online, go ahead and use the Q&A box or the chat box. We'll be monitoring those. And I just wanted to mention our current exhibit over at the museum. I didn't say, but I'm Casey Vance from the Ames History Museum. I think a lot of you know me. But our current exhibit is Black Trailblazers. And that features 9 African-American people from Ames history. So that's a really good one. That one's in the museum. And then in the windows on Douglas Avenue, we have A Woman's Places Everywhere, Groundbreaking Women in Ames History. And that features women in business. So I encourage you to stop by and see both of those if you haven't already. And I will go ahead and pass it over to Kathy from the library.
Thanks, Casey. So welcome to the Ames Public Library, both in person and virtually. We are thrilled as always to present the lecture series in partnership with the Ames History Museum. I'm Kathy Cooney. I am an adult services librarian here. And the library's mission is to connect you to the world of ideas through diverse and inclusive resources and programming like tonight's event. So for those of you with us in person, this room has an induction loop for the benefit of hearing aid users. You just need to switch your hearing aid to T. And we also have a hearing assistance device that we can lend you for the evening. I have it in the back, so just come see me if you'd like to use that. For those of you with us virtually, feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A or chat function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll monitor those to be sure they get shared. If you get bumped out of the Zoom meeting, just follow the original link. You can get right back in. And today's session will also be recorded and posted on the History Museum's YouTube channel. You can also find the link to that video and a list of suggested reading related to tonight's theme at amespl.org/historylectures. And I'll share the link in chat for those of you on Zoom. All right, and at the end, we'll also run around with a microphone for questions. We ask those of you with us in person to use the mic so that the folks at home can hear your question as well as the answer. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Sveck to introduce our speaker.
Tonight's program is funded by Humanities Iowa, which is a private nonprofit state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Humanities Iowa offers a tremendous number of resources to Iowa residents, and we especially appreciate the Speakers Bureau. A number of professionals like David, who you're going to hear tonight, are available to you and your organizations to speak on a great variety of topics. So just Google Humanities Iowa and take a look at the Speakers Bureau. We're very grateful for the funding that allowed David to be here tonight. So David is an Illinois native who married an Iowan. Good for you, David. He spent nearly 2 decades researching dissenters in Iowa, Grinnell residents who helped on the Underground Railroad, and their polar opposites, Iowa Confederates. This research culminated in Iowa Confederates in the Civil War, which has been published by Arcadia Publishing in 2019. He worked for 11 seasons at Living History Farms as a historical interpreter, and he presently works at the West Des Moines Public Library. Please welcome David.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'd like to begin with a tie-in between Josiah Bushnell Grinnell, we'll hear much more about him later, and the city of Ames. In late October 1866, there's a dedication of the Ames Congregational Church building. Not the present one, it was the one that preceded it. And the Reverend George Magoon, who was president of Iowa College, which later became Grinnell College, was giving the sermon during that event. But presiding over it was the Reverend J.B. Grinnell, Josiah Bushnell Grinnell. After Reverend Magoon made his remarks, Grinnell said, you know, I understand that there's an unpaid balance that is owed toward this church building. If we all pull together, I think we can pay it off today. He said, to that end, I will pledge $50. Now, $50 at that time, right after the end of the Civil War, was roughly about what it would take the average working man maybe a month and a half to earn. It was a sizable amount of money. Someone else stood up, I'll pledge this. And by the end, that day, they had paid off the church. And then J.B. Grinnell topped it off by saying, you know, I think I need to contact my friend, Ames Oaks, and who the namesake of the city of Ames, and ask him to donate a bell to this church. Sure enough, Ames Oaks did, and that bell is still present in the present day Ames United Church of Christ Congregational. So that's just a little tie-in to the city of Ames. Now this screen that's in front of you, this shows some of the routes of the Iowa Underground Railroad. The main route follows roughly present day I-80, going from southwest Iowa clear across the state. But of course, there were tributaries that came up north from Missouri and some that branched off elsewhere as well. But mainly, if you think I-80 going across Iowa, you've got a pretty good idea of the Underground Railroad. Now, I spent 6 years studying the Grinnell station of the Iowa Underground Railroad. That is a very tiny little piece of the entire puzzle of the Iowa Underground Railroad. So you might notice that in my presentation, I'm not talking about all these different places or many stories that you might be familiar with. I'm just focusing on one little piece. Without any further ado, let's begin. Preacher, congressman, Negro stealer. Josiah Bushnell Grinnell was called all of these things during his lifetime. The third moniker, Negro stealer, came from participating in the Iowa Underground Railroad. J.B. Grinnell had help from other Grinnell residents, most of whom belonged to the Grinnell Congregational Church. At least 37 fugitive slaves passed through Grinnell on the Underground Railroad from Grinnell's founding in 1854 through 1860. These cases are documented. Less well-documented cases could push the number even higher. Iowa was, for the most part, a racist state before and during the Civil War. Let me explain what I mean by that. Belief in white superiority was the rule, but J.B. Grinnell was an exception. He believed that every human being is made in the image of God, and as such is valuable and deserves respect. He also thought all people should have equal rights. Such beliefs, if you can believe this, were considered radical and even dangerous before the Civil War. Josiah Bushnell Grinnell was born in Vermont in 1821. His father died when J.B. was 10 years old. At a young age, J.B. worked hard and earned the trust of adults. He attended the Oneida Academy, a place designed to train men to preach the gospel. But in reality, the school emphasized abolition and temperance. J.B. became a congregational minister. He served a church in New York State. The Reverend J.B. Grinnell preached about the Bible, heaven, hell, and the resurrection and crucifixion of Jesus Christ. For example, in 1847, Reverend J.B. Grinnell asked in a sermon, "Why is it hard to believe that God can raise the dead?" He was a conscientious minister. On January 17, 1850, after writing a sermon, he wrote in his diary, "Today have done little, read newspapers too much. Oh, for a spiritual mind. Sleep too much, do not pray enough." 2 months later, on April 1st, J.B. Grinnell performed the wedding of an African-American couple. Later that year, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. Under this act, federal marshals were able to force bystanders to help deliver slaves to their masters. This meant that abolition-minded citizens could be coerced into violating their consciences. To help a fugitive slave escape or avoid arrest could result in a huge penalty, up to $1,000 fine and up to 6 months in jail. An early resident of Grinnell, Jesse Macy, called the Fugitive Slave Act one of the most barbarous pieces of legislation ever enacted by a civilized country. Sometime after the Fugitive Slave Act passed, J.B. Grinnell tried to start a congregational church in our nation's capital, in Washington, D.C. He is credited with preaching a controversial anti-slavery sermon. During this period, he courted and married Julia Chapin. This is a picture of Julia much later in life. Shortly after they got married, J.B. took one of his frequent trips that was to mark the rest of his life. He wrote his bride, commending you, my dear, to him who is our constant friend. I am your loving and affectionate husband. J.B. might have kept preaching in New York, but he developed a hoarse throat. With sadness, he left the pulpit. He reports visiting Horace Greeley, the famous editor and publisher of the New York Tribune, asking for advice. Now, J.B. already knew Greeley by serving as a freelance reporter for the Tribune. Have you heard the expression, "Go west, young man"? That's what Greeley told the J.B., but he told it to a lot of other people too. Greeley mentioned that he needed someone to report on the Illinois Agricultural Fair. J.B. accepted this freelance assignment, but he left for Illinois with a dream of starting a colony of like-minded folks out west. After the fair, he looked into starting a settlement in Missouri, where his wife Julia had inherited land. But J.B. changed his mind when he learned that it was a strongly pro-slavery neighborhood. As a colleague of mine said, serendipity was his best friend. J.B. boarded a train in Illinois, heading east, where he met two slave hunters on their way to return a fugitive slave. The slave hunters loudly cursed the North as made up of cowards and slave thieves. J.B. stood up and said, "I oppose slavery," and the men threatened him. An elderly passenger feared for J.B.'s safety. After the slave hunters departed, the elderly passenger introduced himself as Henry Farnham, the man who financed the Rock Island Railroad. Farnham praised J.B. for standing his ground, and he suggested that he move to Iowa, where Farnham was going to build a railroad clear across the state. Farnham implied that a colony could be built near the rail line, and he told J.B. who to contact about the projected route of the railroad. J.B.'s dream, shadowy at first, was starting to take form. He could start a colony and preach in Iowa as long as his throat held out. He quickly placed a notice in 2 New York newspapers calling for settlers of congenial moral and religious sentiments. But the settlers needed to have enough money to make the school and the church paramount and attractive institutions from the outset. 3 men read those words and met J.B. in Iowa. They were Henry Hamilton, the Reverend Homer Hamlin, and Dr. Thomas Holyoke. Those men and a handful of other settlers hewed out a colony on the prairie. Their wives stayed back east. J.B. wrote Julia that he hoped that he was laying foundations for a good colony and for us a home. Eventually, the wives and children arrived. Most of the settlers lived moral lives, and they wanted to educate their children. They opposed slavery, drinking, and the sale of liquor. An early settler and her husband arrived in the Grinnell colony on a hot summer day. They crawled inside their wagon and slept away the afternoon. They were awakened by singing. She had never heard music so sweet. She learned that the men had come in from their work and were having music after supper. She said to her husband, "If we have got into a place where they will sing and pray when they are so tired, I think we have got in the right place." The couple started attending Thursday evening prayer meetings. She later recalled, "I know they did much to help us bear the trials and perplexities of our pioneer life. The Grinnell Congregational Church was the first church in town, and it was closely linked to the early history of Grinnell, but not everyone belonged to the Congregational Church. However, Congregational Church members helped the other Protestant churches in town, especially helping them get started, giving them pews and so forth. On the national scene, U.S. Senator Stephen Douglas promoted popular sovereignty in the Kansas and Nebraska territories. This allowed settlers to determine whether the new state would be slave or free. Pro-slavery settlers, especially from Missouri, and abolitionist settlers, mainly from New England, poured into Kansas. The territory was a tinderbox. Pro-slavery men looted the town of Lawrence, and John Brown and his men vengefully killed 5 pro-slavery men at Osawatomie. The conflict just ramped up. The troubles in Kansas seemed very close to Grinnell residents. Leonard F. Parker stated, "Slavery and anti-slavery filled the air, and John Brown was arousing every man to thought and action." Literate Grinnell residents, both men and women, read the national and local newspapers, and they discussed slavery and Kansas in a lyceum. Now, you may know that a lyceum is a public meeting, kind of like what we're doing right here, right now. The State Congregational Association of Ministers, meeting in Grinnell in summer of 1856, discussed the topic. They expressed indignation over the outrages that have been inflicted upon our fellow citizens of Kansas by hordes of armed men from Missouri for the purpose of crushing out liberty. Shortly afterwards, J.B. began campaigning for the Iowa State Senate. He served 1 term in Iowa City. During his first year of service, in 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott, a slave, wasn't a U.S. citizen, and that Congress couldn't prohibit slavery in the territories. Later that year, the State Congregational Association declared that the Dred Scott decision is contrary to the Word of God and is the moral and civil assassination of the colored race who have rights that we should respect and maintain. The congregational ministers advised all humane and Christian men to disregard its requirements. The next year, Kansas and the slavery question came home to Grinnell in a very personal way. "16-year-old Frances Overton was a slave in Missouri whose master apparently took her with him to Kansas. She escaped and made her way along the Underground Railroad to Grinnell in late 1858. She was fortunate to be in Grinnell. During Frances's stay there, J.B. Grinnell declared in a letter to the editor of the Iowa Statesman in Des Moines that runaway slaves were apt to be fed and warmed here. That was a very bold and risky thing for him to do, saying, yes, we're going to help them. Even better for Frances, the large Grinnell Congregational Church required members to oppose slavery. Members also agreed to respect the rights and privileges of others, regardless of natural, educational, or social differences. They loved to emphasize the biblical text, quoting Jesus, "Inasmuch as ye have done it to the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me." Best of all, Frances found a home with Ames and Augusta Bixby. Ames was a lawyer and an early Grinnell settler. His law practice was very modest, so he farmed on the side, and Augusta worked as a housewife. The Congregational Church had met in their home during the early days. Frances couldn't read or write, so Augusta homeschooled her, besides caring for her own 2 young children. Frances was treated as a family member who shared in responsibilities and helped with household chores. Augusta learned that Frances didn't know that the earth is round. She also lacked religious knowledge. For example, when Frances saw a picture of Jesus Christ on a cross, she asked, "What are they doing to that man up there?" But she also had distorted religious knowledge. Over time, Frances confided to Augusta that her master's sons had sexually abused her. Years later, Amos reflected that hers was but the unhappy lot of slave girls since the world began. A few Grinnell residents thought it was wrong for Frances to live with the Bixbys. The dissatisfaction of a few increased after the Bixbys began taking Frances to Sunday school. 3 months later, Frances won a prize for memorizing the most scripture. Amos later recalled, this caused offense to some white competitors. More controversy came to Grinnell a few months later when abolitionist John Brown and his party rolled into town bristling with weapons. It was an unusually warm Saturday in February. The roads were muddy with the stickiest, blackest substance one can imagine, so adhesive that men used to carry wooden paddles in their pockets to scrape it off with. Brown knocked on J.B. Grinnell's door, saying he was a friend of Julia Chapin Grinnell's father. Brown stated, I'm not here for a social visit. I am the awful Brown of whom you have heard, Captain John Brown of Kansas. Brown sought shelter for 2 nights so he wouldn't have to travel on the Sabbath. Grinnell found housing for Brown, 12 fugitive slaves, and other armed men. Some stayed in the parlor of Grinnell's home, nicknamed the Liberty Room. Others stayed in his wool barn, and others in a local hotel. Curious people poured in from the countryside to see Brown's party, and JB invited him to speak that night. The room was packed on the 2nd floor of the Grinnell School, a room used for congregational church services on Sunday mornings. For 2 evenings in a row, John Brown and his military aide, John Kagi, spoke to cheering crowds. The second night, 3 congregational ministers, including J.B. Grinnell, asked God to bless Brown. They urged listeners to give contributions to Brown. One of them also asked God to forgive John Brown of any wrongful acts he may have committed. Brown objected, saying he didn't ask forgiveness for anything he had done. J.B. Grinnell thanked Almighty God in behalf of the whole company for his great mercy and protecting care. Some in the crowd were upset. One was Nathaniel W. Clark, the father-in-law of Grinnell co-founder Dr. Thomas Holyoke. Clark was a former sea captain who had followed his daughter and Dr. Holyoke to Grinnell. You can see that anchor on the top of his tombstone. Captain Clark knew that John Brown's men had killed a Missouri slave owner and brought runaway slaves with them. Captain Clark saw those slaves as property. Therefore, he thought that John Brown was a murderer and a Negro stealer. Captain Clark resented J.B. Grinnell for honoring Brown. The next morning, John Brown and company stopped their wagons in front of the schoolhouse. Brown asked to speak with Leonard F. Parker, the superintendent and future historian of Poweshiek County. Joanna Harris Haynes was one of the school children who scurried out and gathered around Brown, who sat in the driver's seat of a wagon. She later wrote that some irrepressible pickaninnies pushed up the wagon cover and smiled. Before the party rode off to the Quaker settlement at Springdale, well-wishers pushed cakes into their hands. Isn't that an Iowa thing to do? In the following days, J.B. Grinnell worked with William Penn Clark to arrange for John Brown and company to have a free and safe conveyance to Chicago. Not long afterwards, some Iowa newspapers praised J.B. for welcoming Brown. Others criticized J.B. for letting John Brown speak in church. One wag twisted J.B.'s name, calling him John Brown Grinnell. Decades later, Leonard F. Parker predicted, in the years to come, it may seem remarkable that men stained with blood and planning to take still other lives were admitted with arms in their pockets to this church in February 1859. The town of Grinnell did sympathize with Brown, but it was an honor for him as a friend of an outraged Kansas rather than as an emancipator of either Virginia or Missouri slaves. That summer of 1859, the fugitive slaves who had been with Brown were safe in Canada. In October, Brown's party attacked the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to start a slave rebellion. Instead, Brown was captured, tried, and hanged for treason against the state of Virginia. The hanging came on December 2nd, 1859, just 9 months after his appearance in Grinnell. Now, around this time, Amos Bixby decided to send Francis Overton to Grinnell School. He asked J.B. Grinnell's opinion. J.B. asserted, send her to school, and if anyone dare oppose her, he can't stay in the town 24 hours any more than if he had committed a rape. But J.B. underestimated Captain Clark and his like-minded friends. Francis flourished in Grinnell School and learned very fast, according to Augusta Bixby. Unfortunately for Francis, Captain Clark didn't want his children to attend school on terms of equality with fugitive Negroes. Therefore, he contacted Francis's master in Missouri and a slave hunter who had stopped near Grinnell. The slave hunter had tracked down 2 female slaves from Nebraska all the way to east central Iowa. Captain Clark reportedly told him that a nice piece of property known as Francis is unlawfully harbored in Grinnell. The Bixbys were frightened. Ames later wrote, under the fugitive slave law, the penalties for aiding or for harboring fugitive slaves were so severe that one might well dread them. You see, Ames was struggling financially in the lingering panic of 1857. He eked out a living, but he couldn't even repay his own debts to his father, not to mention other people. In these circumstances, Amos's reputation as an honest man was at risk. But Ames and Augusta still sheltered Francis, likely because they cared about Francis as a person and they loved Jesus. Francis turned their garret, a room just underneath the roof, into a fortress. She reached it through a small hole in the ceiling where she could pull the ladder up after her. Francis kept weapons in the garret. Ames later wrote, if the slave hunters came, she could keep them at bay until the abolition town was aroused. We depended on men such as Harvey Bliss to rescue her. Bliss was the town grocer who rode his wagon regularly to Iowa City. On at least one occasion, it is reported that he carried a fugitive slave. Finally, the danger was so imminent that Ames asked school superintendent Leonard F. Parker to get Francis out of town. Parker also belonged to the Grinnell Congregational Church. That evening, between sunset and sunrise, someone drove a team northward carrying Francis. They intended for Francis to find a home among the Quakers in Hardin County, but she only made it as far as Timber Creek in Marshall County. On February 1st, 1860, Augusta Bixby grieved. My poor black girl is gone. Francis departed as Grinnell was in the midst of a religious revival that had started several weeks earlier. Local ministers, including J.B. Grinnell, held afternoon and evening religious meetings Monday through Friday. Leonard F. Parker's wife, Sarah, wrote to her mother, our meetings are over, but the town is much changed. Captain Clark seems converted, and many of our most hardened ones are praying now. During the revival, a Quaker brought 4 large male fugitive slaves, one in their, I should say they were in their early 20s, to Grinnell from Tabor in far southwest Iowa. Grinnell residents offered them work. Sarah Parker explained, 2 of them wished to go back to Missouri after their wives and children. They were anxious to learn and asked to go to school. Their employers agreed until the spring work came on. The fugitive slaves reasoned that they could better rescue their families if they could read guideposts and friendly written directions. L.F. Parker called the 4 men docile and patient. That probably helped them because they entered the lowest grade, and Edna Marsh Buck was their teacher. The children, according to Parker, were delighted with their woolly hair, curious pronunciation, and jolly good nature. But their presence offended many. Captain Clark, who had 4 daughters in school, was one who objected strongly. On Sunday, March 11th, 66 people joined the Grinnell Congregational Church. 62 of the new members professed faith in Jesus Christ as Savior. JB was seemingly out of town for this event. The following day was the annual Grinnell school meeting. It was usually just a routine event. But this year, Captain Clark plotted with like-minded men to eject the 4 male intruders. L.F. Parker later said that the men had hoped to outwit the abolitionists and make sad Caucasians happy evermore. When the meeting began, Captain Clark and his supporters moved to exclude non-residents from the school. Superintendent L.F. Parker responded that the district would lose lots of tuition money. The motion was defeated. The dissenters forced another vote. Shall colored pupils be received in our schools? It passed by a small majority. One frenzied man stood and said, "They shall never enter those doors unless over my dead body." Some residents verbally attacked L.F. and Sarah Parker, both Oberlin College graduates, considered radicals. One resident slandered Sarah Parker and another Oberlin alumna, Jane Cooper, with sexual innuendo. Augusta Bixby stood up for the Oberlin graduates, and the meeting adjourned. Determined men on both sides expected trouble at school the next day. L.F. Parker arrived early Tuesday carrying a blackthorn walking stick. Captain Clark, holding a very large cane, and Samuel Scotch Cooper entered the school and told the elementary teacher, Edna Marsh Buck, that they would drive the fugitives from her classroom. She went upstairs and found Parker. He flew down the stairs and confronted the men. Captain Clark and Cooper demanded that the fugitives be kept out of school. Parker said he would defend any student who was entitled to attend. The men said, "We know where to find you," and left. Captain Clark and Cooper rejoined a mob that had formed outside the school. A block away, 2 of the African-American students saw the mob with clubs and, it is supposed, concealed weapons. Anti-slavery men joined the black students and armed them with revolvers. One of the students climbed upon a pile of lumber and made a passionate speech. He said that if they must suffer so to gain their freedom and have all these indignities heaped upon them after they had gained it, they might as well die at once. The fugitive slaves then started across the churchyard toward the schoolhouse. Anti-slavery men persuaded the fugitives to turn back, although they preferred to fight their way through the mob and enter the school. Mob members called on anti-slavery men to disarm the fugitives, but they would not, for the fugitives' lives had been threatened, and they would not deprive them of the means of self-defense. Riot ran wild in the streets until noon. A short calm followed. Both sides discussed what to do next, with mob members loudly denouncing L.F. Parker and the fugitives. Wednesday morning was as exciting as Tuesday. Sarah Parker wrote her mother, "Desperate deeds were meditated. Men maddened with hate and rage ran through the streets with insulting words ever on their lips. She feared that her husband might be injured or killed. But we all live, though knives were whetted for hand-to-hand encounters, guns loaded, and pistols made ready." Sarah Parker later wrote, "The town is not settled yet. It will probably divide the Congregational Church, for several members were in the mob. The school closed, is to commence in 3 weeks." The school directors buckled under and changed the rules. They referred to the fugitive slaves as foreign students and required them to pay half of the tuition in advance. This prevented them from returning to school. But one resident, Amos Bixby's aunt, Sarah H. Bixby, dissented against the board's action. She opened her home as a private school for all colored people in town. Sarah Parker contemplated the revival that had preceded the riot. She quoted scripture, "When the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, Satan came also among them. So it has been here." The fugitive slaves lingered a while in Grinnell, working summer jobs on farms and attending Sarah Bixby's school. One of them stayed with Homer Hamlin and his family, and then they left town. Captain Clark may have succeeded in driving the fugitive slaves out of the public school, but he suffered a personal loss. His 5-month-old grandson died shortly after the riot. The baby had been named after him. Captain Clark re-entered the fray less than 3 months later when more fugitive slaves arrived in Grinnell. He alerted newspapers in Iowa and St. Louis of this fact. On July 14, 1860, J.B. Grinnell wrote a note to William Penn Clark that he had sent forward 5 fugitive slaves, 3 women and 2 children, to neighboring Brooklyn. J.B. had learned that there was a reward of $1,000 offered for them at Nebraska City. About a month later, on August 13th, 3 wagons carrying 15 fugitive slaves arrived in Grinnell. Captain Clark sent a detailed hostile letter to the Iowa State Journal. He wrote that a grand abolition rally was got up at the schoolhouse to receive them. Captain Clark stated, J.B. Grinnell introduced them, who, he said, were Southern gentlemen traveling north for the benefit of their health, as was customary at this season of the year, and as they were rather short of funds, he called for a contribution. 3 days later, a writer for the Iowa State Journal claimed to have seen the 3 wagons full of fugitive slaves within 10 miles of Iowa City. The writer claimed that Amos Bixby, then a Republican candidate for a county office, was chaperone of the wagons. Captain Clark's original letter, noting the 3 wagons of fugitive slaves, had triggered a flurry of responses from J.B. Grinnell's supporters, including Captain Clark's very own son-in-law, Dr. Thomas Holyoke. Captain Clark sent a heated response to Dr. Holyoke's letter. In that letter, Captain Clark gave specific details about Francis Overton and the 4 male fugitive slaves. Using a broad brush, Captain Clark stated, as far as the town of Grinnell is concerned, it has a widespread reputation of being the most notorious rendezvous for stolen and fugitive Negroes west of the Mississippi. Many of them are ultra-abolitionists. Amos Bixby and S.F. Cooper are 2 of them, and all the ink that T. Holyoke ever put on paper can't blot it out. Captain Clark fired off a final letter on October 12, 1860. He wrote the journal editor that one of the 4 fugitive slaves had returned to call on Reverend Homer Hamlin. With the start of the Civil War, Captain Clark stopped his letter writing campaign. However, his relationship with his son-in-law, Dr. Thomas Holyoke, deteriorated, if you can imagine that. The state of Iowa charged Captain Clark with maliciously setting on fire a stack of wheat belonging to Dr. Holyoke. Dr. Holyoke testified that his father-in-law had feelings of the most malignant hatred and enmity toward him and had made many threats. Dr. Holyoke said he had lived in continual fear of his father-in-law for a long time. The following year, 1863, Holyoke accused Captain Clark of sticking a pitchfork into his horse. That same year, J.B. Grinnell was elected to Congress. He introduced a resolution encouraging African Americans to enlist in the Union Army. The resolution passed. Afterwards, President Lincoln invited Grinnell to his office and said, "It's a great day for the black man when you tell him that he shall carry a gun. It foretells that he is to have the full enjoyment of his liberty and manhood." Lincoln concluded, "Now tell your people in Iowa, the time has come when I am for everybody fighting the right. Let Indians fight them. Let the Negroes fight them. And if you've got any strong-legged jackasses in Iowa that can kick rebels to death, they have my hearty consent." On another occasion, J.B. complained to Lincoln about dealing with Democrats in Congress. The president said, "Young man," Grinnell was in his early 40s, "forget your annoyances. They are only as flea bites to mine. They are serious comedy, while I am in the focus of tragedy and fire." Debates on the floor of the House of Representatives sometimes became emotional, and J.B. sometimes made scathing remarks. After all, he was only human. Biographer Charles E. Payne notes that sometimes J.B. would accuse Democrats of being in league with slavery and the devil. After the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln's days were running out. JB was back in Grinnell on a Sunday morning, standing on his pastor's porch when he heard that Lincoln was dead. He later recalled, "Our grief was beyond expression. For the first time in my life, I fainted." After the Civil War ended, JB remained in Congress for a couple of years. Historian Payne observes, Grinnell's uncompromising attitude on Negro rights made him many bitter enemies in the House who lost no opportunity to attack him. On one occasion during a lull in the debate, a member from Kentucky rose and proposed that to relieve the tediousness of the hour, our pastoral brother from Iowa be invited to sing an abolition song. Quick as a flash, Grinnell was on his feet with a retort, "I'm not a good singer myself, but I'll propose a verse from Isaac Watts and request the member from Kentucky to do the singing." Grinnell then repeated, "And are we rebels still alive? And dare we yet rebel? And is it not amazing grace that we are out of hell?" The response brought down the House, and Grinnell was never again asked to sing. During his service as an Iowa state senator and as a congressman, JB nearly always voted in favor of measures to help educate, empower, and equip African Americans. On 2 occasions, it's true, he voted against those measures as a matter of political expediency, of timing, but not a matter of principle. In 1890, near the end of his life, J.B. Grinnell gave credit to God for driving him forth from his Eastern home. J.B. said he had hoped to elevate humans and promote the cause of Christ. One of his favorite hymns had these words. I'm going to try to sing it, and if you know this hymn and you'd like to sing along, please join me. Pardon me. Wet my whistle here. A charge to keep I have, a God to glorify, a never dying soul to save and fit it for the sky. To serve the present age, my calling to fulfill. Oh, may it all my powers engage to do my master's will. By reflecting on JB's life, it's possible to discern reasons for his beliefs and actions. Several factors seem apparent. 1, he was probably a well-adjusted person who, as a child, knew he was loved. 2, he trusted Jesus Christ as his Savior and he believed he was forgiven. 3, he embraced the teachings of the Oneida Academy that slavery should be abolished and all people deserve respect. 4, he was surrounded and assisted by many like-minded people in Grinnell, including his wife, Julia. A last word on the March 1860 riot. It had taken time for the Grinnell Congregational Church to recover from the divisive effects of the riot, as you can imagine. A petition actually went around the church, criticizing members who had opposed having fugitive slaves in school. The petition was dropped, but some years later, one erring member cheered a colored graduate of Iowa College, now Grinnell College. Other dissenters supported every radical step in favor of Negroes. I think J.B. Grinnell would have approved. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to open this up for any questions or comments that you might like to share. And thank you, helpers, for making this possible. Please.
How do you know that Francis Overton ended up in Timber Creek?
Okay. It was letters. It was correspondence between, pardon me, it just fell off the, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Sorry, everybody. The clicker just fell open and the batteries fell out. Sorry, staff. That is a great question. I know that because during the Civil War, Amos Bixby and Augusta moved to Colorado. I believe it was still Colorado territory at that point. And he just couldn't make it financially in Grinnell. Years later, L.F. Parker was working on a history of Powashik County. They got in touch with each other and they started writing each other about Amos and Augusta's life in Grinnell. And Francis came up. And so part of the information was because of that correspondence. Another part was, and not particularly devoted to the fact that she ended up in Timber Creek, but at least temporarily, that was her second stop that night was, or the stop that she made was in Timber Creek, going from Grinnell, being lighted up to Timber Creek. But other information I had about Francis was from Augusta was writing to other Bixby family members. And some of the time she discussed Francis. That's a great question. Did that help address?
Kind of. Do you know what happened to Francis?
No, that is a great question. Although I will say this, like I said, Amos discussed Francis in these letters to Leonard F. Parker. And I don't know where physically she ended up, but I got the impression that she had had some relationship problems as an adult, possibly stemming from the abuse she had endured when she was a girl. But I wasn't able to track down, where did she go? Where did she move to? The only idea that I think could be a reasonable lead would be, and I haven't been able to check this out, to go to William Penn, to the Quaker records of the annual meetings, I suppose annual meetings of Quakerism in Iowa held at William Penn College, and look for any veiled, discrete references that you could read into it and say, hey, it sounds like this new person entering our fellowship, and be able to determine maybe Francis went here to this fellowship. But I haven't been able to track that down. But since they mentioned Timber Creek, that's just over the border between the border of southern Marshall County, Timber Creek. And I don't even think, I had to look at a very old map to even find it on a map. I don't believe it's even recognizable today. Thank you for the question. Yes.
Do you know if the Grinnells had children, and is any of the family still around today?
They did have, I believe they did have children. The last living descendant was actually a descendant of one of JB's brothers, an older lady who was keenly interested in Grinnell history. And I believe she died some years ago. So I'm not aware of any more Grinnell family members still living in the greater Grinnell area. Thank you. Please.
Hi, I was wondering if the other fugitive slaves that Grinnell helped, did he track any of them? Did they go on to Canada, or what happened?
I don't know. That is a great question. It raises a couple of possibilities to me. One possibility, since apparently staying in Grinnell was no longer an option, Did they end up in Canada, heading eastward across Chicago and then northern Indiana and then southern Michigan and cross the border into Canada would have been the quickest route? Or did they go back to Missouri to try to rescue their families? I don't know. Or did they end up somewhere, location undisclosed, unknown? Did they end up enlisting in the Union Army? I don't know the answers to any of those questions. Sorry to say.
That's fine. That's it. But they, do you happen to know, and this is off your subject, but do you happen to know what the response was when people did get to Canada? Was Canada welcoming, or was it a hard?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. Does anyone here, have you read up on this? Do you know, were they welcomed in Canada? I'm reluctant to to guess unless I have documentation, unless I've done my homework on things. I would guess that many times they were. And one reason I would say that is because years after the war, there was an African-American community, we'd say emigres, in Canada. So the presence of African-Americans after the conclusion of the Civil War suggests to me that there was some level of acceptance and welcome. They were able to make a new life. That's my thinking. What do you think?
I kind of wonder because I wonder about settlements up there.
Yeah. I don't know. That's a great question. Thank you.
Well, I actually graduated from Grinnell, so I have great questions.
Yes, that's right. By the way, may I mention one other thought that I have about Grinnell College? When Iowa College was founded, it was founded by members of the, originally the idea came from the Iowa Band. From New England, there were congregational ministers and missionaries who wanted to come to the wild west of the territory of Iowa, and they wanted to found congregational churches, and they wanted to start a school. They wanted to evangelize these wild Iowans, if you will. They wanted to start a school. And at the founding ceremony, the dedication of Iowa College, one of the men prayed that Iowa College would be a light to the nations. Now, in spiritual terms, that was to proclaim the gospel spiritually to people. But it seems to me that Grinnell College, which is a very progressive institution, has in its own way been a light to the nation in terms of the number of people, graduates, alumni, who have graduated and have helped and blessed humanity in many, many different endeavors. What do you think? Does that sound reasonable?
Why not?
Yeah, that's just, okay.
I don't have an answer for the question about being welcome in Canada, but we were taking a trip in Nova Scotia and came across a community called Buxton. And of course, we know about Buxton in Iowa.
That's right.
So I think there's probably connections there, but we weren't able to follow up on it.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
I have a couple questions here from our viewers online.
Yes.
How early were Black students admitted to Grinnell College? Do you know?
Oh, I don't know. I might have it in my notes on my laptop, but I don't know right off the top of my head. That is a great question. I don't know. I do know that during the Civil War, this is a little off the subject, but during the Civil War, it was a co-ed institution, and seemingly it was able to keep its doors open during the Civil War. Almost all the male students had enlisted in the Union Army. They kept running because of the female students. They could keep the doors open. But that doesn't address your question. Yeah, great question. I'd have to do some digging. By the way, Look, I'm going to put this up here. Feel free to email me at this email address with any questions. I also write about the Underground Railroad and the lead-up war on my blog, Confederates from Iowa, Not to Defend, but to Understand. Discuss other things Civil War related to what happened in Iowa during the state, but that's just an aside. There's another question. Yes, ma'am.
This is a little bit, this is a question about an area south of Grinnell, New Sharon and Oskaloosa, with their strong Friends Quaker influence.
Yeah.
Can you share anything about their role in the underground or welcoming the fugitives?
No, but I will say this, not too far from there, northeast of there is Linville. It's southwest of Grinnell. It's kind of straddling or almost straddling the county line between Powashik County and Jasper County. Well, Linville still has a strong Friends presence, and at least a Friends presence, Friends Church down there. And there were 4 brothers who lived next to each other right in the Linville area, far southwest Powashik County. Leonard F. Parker stated that those brothers actually had a stop on the Underground Railroad. But I haven't found another source to document, to confirm it. It's very difficult to document new, previously undocumented locations of the Underground Railroad to make sure it's solid. Difficult to do, so I haven't been able to piece that together yet. But no, I can't address how Friends in Oskaloosa and New Sharon helped people just seeking freedom. I can't do that, I'm sorry.
Here's another one from online. What made you interested in researching Grinnell history and the Underground Railroad?
That's a great question. I was at Dordt College attending a conference for teachers and opened this book. It's a history of Iowa basically for 4th or 5th graders. One of the editors was the Grande Dame of Iowa history, Dorothy Schweeder. She had an excerpt of the letter that Leonard F. Parker's wife wrote to her mom about the riot. And it was so shocking. Grinnell, if you've been there recently, you know it's such a nice, quiet, progressive little town and this really amazing college. It's the last place in Iowa that I would have guessed there could have been a riot like this. And it just somehow it caught my imagination and I wanted to know who on earth did this? I wanted to track down. I wanted to know who done it and who stood up for them, who helped the fugitive slaves, etc. So that led me on, it turned into a 6-year wild goose chase to try and piece together the answers that came to fruition in this story tonight. Thank you.
I have an answer to the question about Black students at Grinnell College.
Great.
1863, the first Black student was admitted. Hannibal Kershaw was the first graduate in 1879, and there's a dormitory named after him.
Wow.
Between 1931 and 37, they only had 1 Black student.
Yeah.
And then there were none enrolled between 37 and 47.
Okay.
So not a big Black population in Grinnell,
Right.
but always open to whoever wants to come.
That's interesting. That during the Civil War, thank you for sharing that.
Here's one more question from online. Was there ever sufficient opposition to the abolitionist movement in Grinnell that caused anyone to leave and establish communities elsewhere?
Not that I'm aware of. Now, Powashik County itself you might know that Grinnell is in northern Poweshiek County. In southern Poweshiek County, there were more Democrats and more residents who had forebears from the South or from the Ohio Valley, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. And if people had come to Grinnell from the Ohio Valley, it was kind of a toss-up. Did they have, were they more inclined to favor slavery or not? Were they more affiliated with the South? Were they more Southern thinking, or were they more Northern thinking? It was a toss-up if you came from the Ohio Valley. So Poweshiek County itself was a mixed bag, but in Grinnell, there was, I think of it as a tipping point of enough like-minded people who wanted to support abolition that they could make this work. But no, I can't, I'm not aware of any communities that were formed by disaffected Grinnellians who left the town. Interesting question, though.
Where is the material at that you were using for your research? Is it from the State Historical Society or local museums or individuals, or where did you access these letters and things like that that you used?
It's a great question. A variety of sources. The Grinnell Historical Museum, in the Iowa room of Grinnell College, the Grinnell College Archives. They have wonderful archives down there. Also the State Historical Society of Iowa, the archives in Des Moines and in Iowa City. Those were the principal places. However, when I do my research, I tend to be like a human vacuum cleaner, just hoovering up details and letters and from all over the places. So newspapers that were archived, transcribed, I ended up taking, because I spent 6 years on this, I ended up taking details from many sources and transcribing many of them, and then the primary sources and then secondary sources, and putting them into an annotated timeline where I could have access to answering specific questions and specific names and so forth, and set it in the context of local, statewide, and national events, just to make it easier to people who might come later on, who might want to track this down for themselves. But I'm really dedicated to the idea that you need to document things. My opinion just by itself isn't, it isn't worth much, but documentation, I think that's the key. Thank you.
You've talked about the Blacks who were out in the open. Were there also ones that were hidden that you know of? That actually traveled the Underground Railroad underneath?
Yeah. Well, there's one story that I haven't documented. I mean, I haven't been able to corroborate it, but one story from Grinnell had either a Baptist or a Methodist minister, I suspect a Baptist minister, who got gussied up and having a young adult, male and female African-Americans dressed up in finery and posing as his servants or slaves and traveling on railroad to Chicago and then across Indiana, across southern Michigan, and then over to Canada as a way to get them to freedom. I just haven't been able to corroborate it. But yes, there were African-Americans who Grinnell did not stick around a town like Grinnell. Absolutely. Grinnell was really, I think, an unusual case for the state of Iowa. Yeah, it's a great question. Yes.
Do you feel like you have finished up with this part of your research, and what's next?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think I pretty much have finished up with this area of my research. Although it would be interesting to track down that 1863 alumnus from Grinnell College who lady in the back she referred to at Grinnell College, because that's a very interesting little detail. And I'd like to see if I can, corroborate it and see what I can dig up. What's next? Well, something totally unrelated. I have a daughter who's now 22, but when she was just a few years old, we were living 6 miles north of Malcolm, about 13 miles from Grinnell. And I started making up stories for her about a penguin from South America who lived with his family in Massachusetts. And I've written the first installment of that. I finally have gotten around to writing it down, and I want to write more about that and turn it into a children's book. You know how sometimes the stories that you might, if you're a parent or a grandparent, sometimes the stories that you might tell to children or grandchildren, it can be kind of endearing. So, thank you.
And the penguin's name is?
Pox.
Pox.
Yes, Pox. If it's a penguin, it's got to have kind of a quirky name, right?
Almost a Massachusetts accent on it.
Thank you. Good point. Anybody else? Hey, thank you all. Thank you all for coming tonight and giving up your time and coming here and sharing this evening together. Thank you.
Let's give David a round of applause. Thanks again, everyone, for coming. It is so wonderful to see all of you here. You've all been so loyal for so many years, and oh my gosh, it's great to have you back. But thank you, and thank you, David. What a great storyteller, don't you think? Amen. Thanks a lot, though, and thanks for coming.